What's up, guys? Energy Physio got a good one for you today. All right. Over the past couple of weeks, we've been talking a lot about pain, pain's presentation, kind of the way we as human beings think about pain and what we correlate that to. We've also thrown a little bit out there about receiving diagnostic imaging too early in the process of differential diagnosis and the detriment that that can create. So the world saw fit to lob me a really good case study today. I saw this kid this morning, and we're going to kind of make the case around that over the next couple of minutes. The question that I want to put out there is this: can you correctly treat a misdiagnosis? Or maybe a better way to say that is, if you incorrectly diagnose a problem, can you correctly treat that effectively? The answer is no. If you diagnose something as this comes along with a certain set of treatment to make that problem better. And if you incorrectly diagnose a problem, you're going to be way off on your treatment protocols for solving that problem. And this one is a wild, stark difference in treatment protocol based on the findings we're going to get. So here's how it goes down. In 8th grade, this kid's running the football, gets his arm yanked across his body, and develops pain and popping. All right, goes to the doctor and gets pushed out for an MRI immediately. All right. So fast forward now, 3 years later. So this kid's been dealing with this for 3 years. Now he's a lineman, so he's pushing other big, heavy dudes around. He's had his pain for 3 years. He's 16 years old now. We're dealing with left shoulder and still got this pain and popping. These are the only two symptoms we've had, pain and popping. So he gets his MRI, comes back totally negative, like zero findings on MRI whatsoever. So no rotator cuff tears, no biceps tears, no labral tears, and really what I want to hone in on is no indications of instability or chronic dislocation, which is typically represented by a Hill-Sachs lesion, basically where the bone pops out of socket, and as it comes back in, basically the bones ram together and create essentially a bone bruise, and that's called the Hill-Sachs lesion. And that's our kind of hallmark sign of chronic dislocations. So we get this MRI, totally negative, and then somehow he still got diagnosed with an unstable shoulder. And this diagnosis was created on anatomy alone. So on this image, they looked at it, there was no structural dysfunction, but they said, hey, you know what? Your glenoid fossa is a little small compared to the head of your humerus. Basically, the socket is a little small, which in the shoulder is not as much of a socket. It's more like a golf tee and the golf ball sitting on top of it. So if you can imagine that, the tee is relatively small compared to the golf ball. They said, your socket's a little small, and so your shoulder's probably, unstable. It's probably sliding around way too much because your socket's way too small for the ball you've got. So this kid and his dad, they come out of this thing with this idea that your shoulder's really unstable. It moves too much. And so I sit down with him today, and we're talking a little bit. I'm like, so just kind of give me the rundown. He's like, well, I have an unstable shoulder. I had an MRI a couple of years ago that said I have an unstable shoulder. They said, my socket's too small for the ball, and so I can just move my shoulder too far. And he gave me one of these, and he thought that was insanely too far for the shoulder to be going, when really it's 180 degrees of flexion, which we would consider normal. So we dive in a little bit. I'm talking to him about what hurts, what bothers him, and power cleans bother him, receiving a power clean. Getting all the way overhead bother him a little bit. And so we dive in a little further. And so I'm kind of thinking, man, you know what? You got an image too early. Let's go ahead and see what your clinical presentation looks like. So we start doing some motion testing. He's missing 30 degrees of flexion, and it's painful. Missing 20 degrees internal rotation plus pain, 30 degrees of external rotation plus pain. So already, just on some standard motion testing, this kid's overstable. He's not unstable at all. He's missing a ton of motion. So then we really dive into his capsular mobility. And so the capsule is just a fibrous sac that surrounds the joint. The rotator cuff blends in, really creates a good dynamic stability through this whole system. And as we dive in, the back of his capsule and the bottom of his capsule are like pressing into a brick. I mean, there's no motion in it whatsoever. So it's no surprise to me why he's missing a bunch of motion. His joint capsule is so stiff, his joint can't move normally. And so then we get to have this conversation like, look, man, 3 years you've been dealing with this like it's an unstable shoulder. Your shoulder does not move well at all. It's actually overstable. And that brings us back to this question. Can you correctly treat an incorrect diagnosis? And the answer is still 100% no. The way you treat an unstable shoulder is wildly different than an overstable shoulder. You would never do aggressive mobilizations on an unstable shoulder unless you want to dislocate your patient's shoulder. And by all means, do some aggressive mobilizations. Don't do that. But this kid needs aggressive mobilization because his joint doesn't move normally at all. And so this idea of early imaging that creates a misdiagnosis based on anatomy alone that is not correlated to a history, a pain pattern, and a functional movement clinical presentation, that image is not worth anything. And so you need to know, if you're watching this as an athlete or a patient, a client, somebody who's not a clinician, you need to know that it's your money. And if you go see a doc and you have pain, you can respectfully decline the MRI or the x-ray because you need to find somebody who can correlate your deficit and dysfunction to your pain before we try to find a structural problem as the cause for your pain. Because the truth is, there's a lot of structural problems going around in asymptomatic people. We've got a lot of good research to support that. So you can say, let's try something else. Let's try some PT. Do you have any other options? Because at the end of the day, we want MRI to be used pre-surgery so our surgeons can know what they're getting themselves into. Or this situation, which is my favorite, where a patient comes in and they've got, let's just say, 5 deficits around their shoulder or their knee or their hip, their low back, whatever it is. They've got 5 deficits. We're going to resolve all 5 deficits. And then if that pain still persists, now let's get an MRI because we've taken all dysfunction off the table and we've still got pain. Now we need to know what structurally is wrong that is producing this pain because there's no dysfunction around that. And so be thinking about your own pain. Next time you go to the doc, don't jump straight for the MRI. Find somebody who can help you kind of diagnose your deficit and your dysfunction and correlate that to your movement patterns before we jump down the rabbit hole of structure and anatomy, which is not going to provide very good information without a good history and a clinical presentation to go along with it. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed that. A little case study on a kid I saw today. Really highlighted some of the things we've been talking about over the last couple weeks. Feel free to leave some questions, comments. I'll be glad to get back with you and answer any of those that I can. See you later.